is.
Is the level going?
But okay, so then my question is, even if I can't really hear myself and like I feel as if I'm being drowned out by the music, that's okay because the music is okay in the studio? Is that the case? Okay. Okay.
Is it just too high? What's?
I I mean, they'll figure it out.
Oh, I'm just curious.
I just wanted to know that I'm not like. What time is it? 3:54. Okay, so I spoke with Richard John, a Columbia professor who specializes in the history of technology and communications. He says this isn't the first time Google's come under scrutiny. And now the heart of the issue is access. And now, okay. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Teresa Avila. I spoke with Richard. Richard John is the author of Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications. Often the visa holders' husbands and wives have to leave their own careers behind. Here in the United States, they aren't allowed to work. That's about to change. Adelie Ponte reports that as of next month, 200,000 of these foreign nationals will be able to apply for work permits. That sounds okay, does it? Or does that sound okay?
I think so.
Maybe do you mind if I read this? Just preface?
That's fine. I'm like, you don't mind me.
I don't know if you need this or not, but there's no tape or anything. It's just the in here and out cue. So
Okay.
it should be okay.
Oh, we still don't have the second half? Or
Why is this going?
oh, we do. Hey,
Oh, okay.
do we have the second half of the script? No.
No. They'll bring it to us during their return.
Really?
From Columbia Radio News, I'm Hava Garari. In Queens this morning, at least 2 people were
In the last decade, the
hospitalized
price of
after a truck
commercial
drove
space
into a
has
grocery
almost
storefront.
doubled.
A school bus was damaged in the incident.
Camille Von
but none of
Canel?
the 23 children on
Camille
board were
Von
injured, according to a
Can-
fire department chief.
Camille Von
Assembly
Canal.
Speaker Carl Hasty convened a
No, I
board
know.
meeting
I think I
yesterday
just see your name
to
and I
fight
like
corruption in
automatically
New
freak
York
out.
politics.
Camille Von
Hasty, a Bronx Democrat, replaced Sheldon Silver,
Canal.
who was replaced former
Camille Von Canal.
Wear the distinctive red and white
Silver,
striped
who
hat.
was indicted for taking more than $4 million in bribes, among other charges, earlier this year.
You
The
guys,
initiative fulfills a promise Hasty made.
you might
when
want to turn our
elected in
mics off.
February.
It's Friday, April 17th, and you're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Ariana Skybell.
And I'm Teresa Avila. Commercial rent in Manhattan has almost doubled in the last decade, hurting small business owners along the way.
At these prices, at these rents, we cannot afford to be closed more than a week.
People who have albinism, a condition where they lack pigment in their skin, say they're still the target of discrimination.
One kid came to him and said that he was like a rattlesnake because rattlesnakes are white and rattlesnakes are evil, so my son must be evil.
Mixed martial arts might be closer to becoming legal in New York. Fighters say the cage is safer than people think.
It's the most peaceful place on earth and chaos at the same time.
The spouses of foreign workers want the right to work too. Groups of white people are talking about race and a look ahead at the 2016 election.
But first, this news.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Pro-government militias in Iraq claim that they killed a former deputy to the late dictator Saddam Hussein. That has not been independently verified, and there have been reports of his death in the past. Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri has been a fugitive for more than a decade. He became an underground figure described to have links with militant insurgencies, including with the self-proclaimed Islamic State. A website often used for statements from ISIS states the group is behind a car bomb blast in northern Iraq that has killed at least 3 people. NPR's Alice Fordham reports ISIS also claims it's responsible for an explosion in Erbil today outside the U.S. consulate.
When the car detonated in the city of Erbil, it was just outside the gate to the U.S. consulate on a street in a Christian neighborhood. A State Department spokeswoman says no embassy staff were wounded in the attack, but Iraqi security officials say there were deaths and injuries among people on the street, which has a number of popular cafes. Security in Erbil is usually better than the rest of Iraq, and car bombings are rare, whereas in the capital, Baghdad, more than 24 people were killed in car bombs Friday. Alice Fordham, NPR News.
President Obama is praising an agreement among congressional leaders that would give President Obama power to negotiate a huge trade pact with Pacific nations. U.S. and Japanese officials are working on the accord. NPR's Anthony Kuhn reports from Beijing they're trying to finish it before a U.S.-Japan summit in Washington at the end of the month.
Economics Minister Akira Amari says that the two countries are currently holding working-level talks. The sticking points are agricultural and automotive products, which both countries want to protect. Yesterday, congressional leaders agreed on a bill giving President Obama authority to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Pact, or TPP. A deal between the U.S. and Japan remains crucial, as the two countries account for 80% of the economic output of the 12 Pacific Rim nations in the TPP. Anthony Kuhn, NPR News, Beijing.
Researchers say a technique that physically removes a blood clot in the brain is better than the standard drug treatment in some patients. NPR's Richard Harris reports on this advance in treatment for stroke.
Doctors have been trying for many years to develop a technique that would let them snake a tool into a blocked artery in the brain so they can grab and remove a blood clot there. Several previous efforts have failed, but the New England Journal of Medicine notes that 5 new studies of an improved technology show this approach can be effective. Patients need to be operated on quickly before the clot causes widespread brain damage, and they also need to go to a specially equipped hospital. The technique is potentially effective for about 10% of blood clot strokes, but in those people it can be better than traditional drug treatment. Richard Harris, NPR News.
Before the close, Dow is down 1.5% at 17,826. This is NPR.
From Columbia Radio News, I'm Chava Garari. In Queens this morning, at least 2 people were hospitalized after a truck drove into a grocery storefront. A school bus was damaged in the incident, but none of the 23 children on board were injured, according to a fire department chief. Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie convened a board of lawmakers today to fight corruption in New York politics. Hastie, a Bronx Democrat, replaced former Speaker Sheldon Silver, who was indicted for taking more than $4 million in bribes, among other charges. This initiative fulfills a promise Hastie made when elected in February. A group of doctors is pressuring to remove Dr. Mehmet Oz, the host of the Dr. Oz Show from Columbia University's Department of Surgery. They say the medicine he presents on his show is questionable. A U.S. Senate committee criticized Dr. Oz last year for allegedly peddling a magic weight loss cure. Columbia University says they do not regulate their faculty speech and have no plans to take any action. Over 150,000 New York City students opted out of taking standardized school tests this week. joining a nationwide movement. School officials say they don't know how many of the 1.1 million middle school students opted out. In some schools, it was more than 80% of the student body. The opt-out movement is in protest of the Common Core testing implemented 2 years ago. Parents feel they're not being heard after more than a year of protesting at town hall meetings. Next week, Tuesday, the standardized math test begins, and the citywide opt-outs are expected to continue. The L train will be closed for 5 weekends, beginning this weekend. Small business owners are concerned that this will negatively affect their businesses, and long-suffering L train riders have one more thing to complain about. Chava Garari, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Teresa Avila.
And I'm Ariana Skybell. Google is facing legal sanctions from the European Union as regulators filed a complaint against the company earlier this week. They allege the tech giant is unfairly promoting its own applications and suppressing the competition.
I spoke with Richard John, a Columbia professor who specializes in the history of technology and communications. He says this isn't the first time Google's come under scrutiny, and now the heart of the issue is access.
Access to search results, which is a rather limited issue, but it's one that is particularly sensible for the regulators to focus in on because it will bring into the arena a number of well-funded rivals who are understandably concerned about Google's ability or perceived ability to limit reach with which they can attract potential users.
The approach that the EU seems to be taking is targeting Google shopping.
It's the online search results for travel, for consumer goods, and these are issues around which it's very easy to arouse the suspicions not only of the regulators but also of rivals because it's very difficult to know precisely how the Google algorithms work. The key competitive advantages that Google has touted for many years is that it has a secret sauce and that, therefore, it should be permitted to proceed as it sees fit.
Is the concern here with how Google is affecting potential competitors or consumers?
The end user or the consumer is the rhetorical object, but in fact, the contest will be waged between deep-pocketed players. It's very difficult to mobilize users if you're going to mount an anti-competition, or we call it antitrust challenge. So the strategy is a sensible one to go at those Google applications which you can rally opposition to easily from within the business world, because this is going to be largely fought out between Google and its lobbyists and Microsoft and Amazon and other big players and their lobbyists.
In terms of how the EU is approaching this, are there any parallels here with the net neutrality arguments that have been made in the U.S.?
The net neutrality debate in the United States is one in which Google has been largely on the side of the angels, that is to say, on the side of access. And that's because their business model in the United States depends largely on eyeballs, which enables them to obtain advertising. So any constraint upon net neutrality can be perceived as a threat to Google's business model. Now, Google is in an odd position of claiming to be indifferent as to who looks at its site. But in fact, Google has been cutting deals with various players in Europe that would undermine any credible claim that it could make that it's championing whatever the European counterpart to net neutrality is.
Is this attempt at regulation by the EU an example of a culture clash when it comes to American and European attitudes toward big business?
Well, that's a fascinating question. We gave the world antitrust. This is not a European idea. This is an American idea. We imported it to the Germans and the Japanese after the Second World War. European governments were comfortable with cartels. It was often said in Europe you could get a medal for this kind of business practice that in the United States would land you in jail. The United States has been the trust buster. But in the last 20 years or so, it's been very difficult for the Justice Department to succeed in lawsuits. What I see as different is the direct appeal to business rivals.
Thank you, Professor John, for being here with us today. This was a great discussion.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Richard John is the author of Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications.
Hundreds of thousands of highly skilled foreign workers come to the United States every year for jobs. Most work for technology companies on visas known as H-1Bs, and many of them bring their spouses with them.
Often, the visa holders' husbands and wives have to leave their own careers behind. Here in the United States, they aren't allowed to work. That's about to change. Adelie Ponte reports that as of next month, 200,000 of these foreign nationals will be able to apply for work permits.
Every day, Neha Mahajan picks up her younger daughter when class lets out.
Hi, She. Hi.
After her first daughter was born, she set aside her career as a television journalist in India.
Okay, let's get in the car.
She was ready to go back to work when her husband announced that he'd been promoted. His company wanted him to move to New York to work in the IT department of a finance company. And since then, she hasn't been able to work a single day.
It might sound cliched, but I am not the kind of human being I had envisioned I would become.
Mahajan came to the U.S. on what's known as an H-4 visa. It's for spouses of highly skilled workers, but it does not give the spouses permission to work. Mahajan's 9-year-old daughter wonders why her mom is always at home.
She would ask me, why don't you work? And I would tell her that, oh, you know what, President Obama doesn't want me to work, so that's why I'm sitting here.
It's regulations, and not the president, that prevent her from working. And they'd been on the books for years before Obama took office. Late last year, when the president took executive action to change immigration law for undocumented immigrants, he also changed the employment picture for spouses like Mahajan, who have permission to live here, but not permission to work. The visa they have is often called the trailing spouse visa or the depression visa. The majority of them come from India or China, and like their partners, most of them are highly skilled professionals. Neha Mahajan has had a hard time coming to terms with the reality that she can't have a career.
I could not be a mentor to my girls like I had imagined myself to be. If I had a solid career for myself, my girls would look up to me, right? They would want to become like me. I don't know right now what they think of me.
Critics of the H-4 visa say the rules are inconsistent, and some spouses of workers who have other visas can work. Most of them come from Europe or Australia. Shivali Shah is an immigration attorney in Washington who sees no logical reason why spouses from Asia should be treated differently.
So why is it that we don't give the spouses of H-1B workers that same privilege? The fact that we're treating these predominantly Asian workers not as full human beings is patently unfair and borderline racist.
Not working takes a toll on the spouses, according to Pallavi Banerjee. She's a sociologist at Vanderbilt University who's been studying H-4 visa holders for several years.
Some of the husbands of H-4 visa holders actually told me that they were so concerned about their wives being depressed and not being able to come to terms with the fact that they were legally dependent, that these men often would call their wives multiple times just to make sure that they haven't jumped out of the window.
She found that women on H-4 visas battle depression and suicidal thoughts. She also studied some of the men who have followed their wives here.
I think this is important because the men had different kinds of issues, and a lot of the men I talked to had taken to excessive drinking and smoking.
Things will start changing on May 26th. For some of them. That's when some visa holders will be able to apply for work permits. Neha Mahajan was happy to break the news to her daughter.
She's like, oh, so can you start working now? So I'm like, yeah, President Obama has, allowed it for us now.
Over 170,000 H-4 visa holders are expected to apply for permission to work, but the majority will not be able to. Neha Mahajan is among the lucky ones because she meets the requirements. Her husband's company is sponsoring his application for a green card now that he's been working there for a minimum of 6 years. Immigration attorney Shivali Shah is critical of the new regulation because most workers either haven't been here long enough or don't have sponsors and can't apply for green cards.
the number of people that will be benefited by this law is very small compared to the number of women that need work authorization.
Neha Mahajan is excited by the prospect of a new job, but she's a little worried about finding one.
Who's gonna look past 7 years of no work experience, really, and offer me a job? They might feel I'm obsolete.
Do you feel obsolete?
7 years of doing nothing, sitting at home, doing only volunteer work part-time here and there.
After the first year clears out the backlog, the number of applicants for work permits is expected to stabilize at 55,000 per year. Adelie Ponte, Columbia Radio News.
More than 35 years ago, a boy named Eitan Pats, who was 6 years old, disappeared on his way to school and was never seen again.
In 2012, Pedro Hernandez, a former store clerk with a history of mental illness, told investigators he lured the boy into a bodega basement and killed him. Now, at the end of a 2-month trial, jury members are nearing a verdict.
I interviewed Lisa Cohen, who wrote the book After Eitan, The Missing Child that Held America Captive. I first asked her about the evidence presented to the jury.
The prosecution has very, very compelling videotape of Pedro Hernandez confessing. They also have some witnesses who testified that Pedro Hernandez confessed different versions of a story about hurting or killing a boy in the years between 1979 and when he was arrested. And that's tricky because, as the defense attorney has said, their evidence is based on a completely unreliable source, which is Pedro Hernandez. The defense argues that he is mentally unstable, he is delusional, and he was convinced by the police that he did this crime.
And in your book, After Eitan, The Missing Child Case That Held America Captive, you sort of explore alternatives to Hernandez's guilt.
Well, at the time that I reported the book, there were hundreds of leads, and they all went nowhere. And then there was one assistant U.S. attorney who had the case for several years, and he pursued one particular lead, a man named Jose Antonio Ramos, who was a known pedophile, and he had a connection to the Pates family because he was involved with a woman who took care of Eitan for a brief period of time right before the disappearance. And she had a son, and Jose Ramos molested her son, and that is known. And he may or may not have had contact with Eitan directly. There's some evidence to believe that. And he made very incriminating statements to both law enforcement and to two informants who were inserted into a prison cell with him by law enforcement. So he had a motive, he had a history, and he incriminated himself. Having said that, there is this incredibly compelling videotape and these really compelling confessions by Pedro Hernandez. So it's really a question of whether or not the jury is going to be swayed by this video or whether they're going to consider those the confessions of somebody who really is not reliable.
What do we know about giving false confessions? I mean, how possible is it that he, given his mental state, is not telling the truth?
I think it's possible that Pedro Hernandez has convinced himself or has been helped by the police to convince himself that he did this. I think one of the troubling aspects of that theory is that he also had made these incriminating statements to different people throughout the years before the police were involved. But the thing that I find really interesting about the confession, the part of the confession that we see on camera, it's so eagerly offered. It's the words of a man who seems to be wanting to help and wanting to assist the police. And the defense attorney suggests that he was so suggestible that at a certain point he felt like he was part of the team and he really wanted to be involved and help out. That's why he was so detailed and so clear in his confession.
Throughout the last 30 years, I mean, what are the major mistakes you think the police have made in dealing with this case?
There was a moment when Jose Ramos came to the attention of the police in the Bronx. He was arrested for trying to entice some young boys into a drainage tunnel where he was living. And at that point, he himself voluntarily offered up that he knew the woman who took care of Eitan and that there was this connection. And at that point, there was an opportunity to really investigate him thoroughly, and there were ways in which they could have followed up on that may have yielded more evidence. And they it's unclear what happened, but nothing happened.
From your whole time following what's been happening, what do you think the jury's going to decide?
I honestly don't know. I kept sitting there thinking the whole time I was in the courtroom, I'm really glad that I don't have to make this decision.
In the last decade, the price of commercial space in Manhattan has almost doubled.
And nearly 200,000 small businesses in New York City are having trouble keeping up. Recently, Pearl River Mart announced it will close after 40 years because the landlord raised the rent 4 times the previous rate to $500,000 a month.
As Camille Von Cannell reports, some City Hall politicians and advocacy groups are working to level the playing field.
Rags A Go-Go is a small vintage clothing store on West 14th Street between 8th and 9th. It's not quite the meatpacking district, not quite Chelsea. Joshua Suzanne has owned this place for 15 years. She tells a young couple browsing the racks to check out the lower level.
And if you wander downstairs, it's all vintage vinyl records, all $5.99.
Great. Okay. Vinyl records are what's saving this business from disappearing. Her 15-year lease was up last year, and suddenly she was facing a new, higher rent.
So I said, guys, I really can't go to that, $12,500. From $6,300 to $12,500. That's doubling a rent, basically.
To make some extra money, she turned her lower level from a storage space into the record shop. It opened 2 months ago and has been helping her make ends meet. But she says if something unexpected happened, like another hurricane or a terrorist attack, she wouldn't make it.
At these prices, at these rents, we cannot afford to be closed more than a week. We'll all start going under.
That's exactly the risk for several businesses in the East Village. On March 26, a gas leak explosion killed 2 and leveled 3 buildings on 2nd Avenue. Some stores on the block are still closed. But Paul's Burgers, just a few feet away from where the blast happened, is open for business.
It's $15, sir. Thank you very much. Next.
The line snakes out the door. Customers fill every seat. They're here to spend some cash. This small business crawl was organized by #SaveNYC, a new campaign to support small businesses. Jackie Broner helped organize the crawl. She says the issue is bigger than the crisis of the gas explosion.
Small business owners that have been here 50 years are losing their businesses and losing their livelihood. And it's not fair. How many CVSs do you need? I mean, I love CVS. They're a great store, but we don't need one every corner.
Higher commercial rents make way for another bank or big corporate chain. Jonathan Bowles is the director of the Center for an Urban Future, and he says there's a strong economic reason for the city to do more to protect small businesses. They have jobs.
Over the last 13 years, the bulk of the growth in businesses have been in firms with fewer than 5 employees.
Some of that is because of the tech entrepreneur boom, but some are the mom-and-pop stores, the bodegas, the restaurants, the hair salons, the types of businesses Jackie Brunner and Save NYC are trying to rescue. So at Sunday's Small Business Crawl, Brunner is collecting signatures.
Oh, sure. Where's the petition? The petition is right here.
The petition is for the Small Business Jobs Survival Act. Brunner says it would put an end to rent gouging and exorbitant increases. A version has been kicking around City Hall for more than 3 decades without passing. Linda John from Morningside Heights is trying to make sense of the act.
So what the bill actually entails is putting into place a negotiation process. That's the bill.
That's the bill.
Okay.
Precisely.
Okay.
Would you like to sign?
Yes.
Okay.
The bill would also include a 10-year minimum lease. Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer has also started a fight for small businesses. She unveiled her own plan about a month ago. She wants the city to put in place a mandatory negotiation period at the end of each lease.
To make sure that both parties sit down at the same table. That is mandated. But, sometimes a deal can't happen, and that's where we would do the 1-year extension.
She calls this short lease extension a safety valve. It gives businesses time to look for a new place before getting kicked out. Brewer has been on this issue for a while. She sponsored a bill like this 30 years ago, but it's just never passed.
The issue is for us is that we actually want something to pass.
Lawyers are currently drafting the new bill. And Brewer will be talking to the community about her plan at several roundtables in May. Kimmy Von Canal, Columbia Radio News.
This morning, the city gave an update on all the new developments taking place throughout the borough that aim to induce economic growth.
Among the projects discussed was City Point, a new mall opening in downtown Brooklyn in early 2016. It and other developments have businesses across the borough worried. Alistair Gardner reports.
When City Point opens, there'll be a large food mall inside with about 45 restaurants. Just across the street, on the corner, is a small food stall run by a man who gave his name as Emmanuel. He said he's been doing this for a long time.
23 years.
In this spot?
In this spot, yeah.
23 years in this spot?
Yeah, same spot.
He says when City Point opens with its 45 restaurants, of course it's going to have an effect on business for him.
But any business open next to you, serve food and drinks, maybe they bother you. They're going to bother you, no matter what. You can't stop anybody to do whatever they want. Maybe I don't like it. Maybe I don't like it, but I can't stop anybody.
At that morning's conference at Brooklyn Borough Hall, Michael Lambert, the executive director of the Bed-Stuy Gateway Business Improvement District, acknowledged this issue.
So that basically they aren't priced out, and also to look for opportunities in terms of, how can they become more viable as either long-term tenants or acquiring property themselves, so basically they become their own landlords.
He explained that smaller businesses all over the borough are going to have to adapt or die. In other words, they need to start thinking like realtors.
Small business owners that seek help from governmental agencies like ours or SBS or SCORE, they are 60% more likely to be successful.
The problem is, many of these businesses don't have the wherewithal to do this. But there are places that can help, like Brooklyn Small Business Development Center. The agency's director, Michael Medias, says the advice they give works.
Everybody wants to take down 4 or 5 buildings and which house small business owners, put up a hotel.
He agrees with Michael Lambert of Bed-Stuy that this is all about property. People call it gentrification, he says, but what they really mean is everyone has to start thinking like a landlord.
Leases are expiring and the smaller people are being sort of forced out. I've got to find new neighborhoods, and of course if you're a small business owner, you rely on foot traffic and brand loyalty. If all of a sudden you got to move, that's a problem.
The food cart operator named Emmanuel doesn't have this option. And he's not sure how he's going to adjust his business plan when City Point opens.
You think, what happens if you're forced to move? You move to a different place?
Do I go to a different place? No, I don't think so.
You stay here?
Yeah.
You stick it out?
Yeah. This is my station. Yeah. I can't move.
He has until early next year to figure that out. Alistair Gardner, Columbia Radio News.
Commentator Miriam Sitz committed criminal trespass when she was a teenager. The fact that she and her friends didn't get caught, she says, is a tribute to their cunning and meticulous preparation.
Katy, Texas, 2004. I was just 15 and had 2 accomplices, Abby and Sarah. We were all super straight-edge kids. But that fall, we hatched a plan to climb a water tower. There were rumors of others who'd done it years before, gone up to spray paint their initials or the rival high school's mascot. But our plan felt more important. We knew we could outsmart the powers that be. They'd never expect docile young things like us to do something so audacious. So we planned our scheme for weeks. We even took a recon mission to the tower, just scoping things out. It loomed over the cemetery where my grandparents were buried, standing like a sentinel at the border between suburbia and country. We made contingency plans, cover stories that would keep our real mission a secret. If my parents caught us sneaking out, I had a roll of toilet paper in my backpack to show that we were just planning to wrap a house. If we were caught closer to the graveyard, the candles and matches in Sarah's bag would prove that we were just trying to scare ourselves with a midnight seance. We each wore 2 sets of clothes, a layer of black over a layer of white, to blend in with the night and then with the tower. And we had no contingency plan for being apprehended at the site, because we were 15, and there was no way we wouldn't succeed. Abby and Sarah slept over. Close to midnight, bags packed, we snuck out, grabbed the 3 bikes stashed next to my garage, and took off. 10 minutes later, we arrived. We climbed over the barbed wire fence one by one, Abby first, according to plan. She was nimble, a gymnast, and easily scaled the chain link to help me and Sarah over from the inside. We made it to the water tower's ladder, suspended and locked some 10 feet in the air, like on a fire escape. We shimmied up an electrical box nearby, stretching to reach the lowest rung, and then we climbed. Up one long ladder, then a second, to the very top. An aircraft warning light spun around, bathing us alternately in red light. We looked west, and it was just dark, pastures and farmland. But when we turned east, we saw the Houston skyline. It took an hour to get there by car, but standing on the tower, the city looked so much closer. And then we took pictures, blinding ourselves with the disposable camera flash. Maybe not the smartest idea for 3 people who didn't want to get caught. But we weren't. We won. It was the ultimate nerd victory. Technically, we broke the law, but we didn't really do anything bad. Our planning paid off. We executed with precision and cunning. And sometimes, when I'm finishing a story, I get that same feeling. When I know I've covered all my bases and turned up something really good, with the research and interviews and documents to back it up. Sometimes, journalism is the ultimate grown-up nerd victory, and I don't even need to wear 2 layers of clothes.
Miriam Sitz does not condone vandalism, but she's not too worried about trespassing. This is Uptown Radio. I'm Teresa Avila.
And I'm Ariana Skybell. Uptown Radio is online at uptownradio.org. You can also listen to us on air at WBAI FM every Monday at 5 a.m. Here's what you can look forward to in the second half of the show.
4 candidates have thrown in their name in the ring to become our next president. We'll get an update on the 2016 election.
And organizations running after-school programs in New York City come together to find funding.
At a forum today, the mother of Eric Gardner said his killing at the hands of police was a violation of human rights.
All that and more to come, but first, the news.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Adelie Ponte. One of Saddam Hussein's highest-ranking officials was killed today by the Iraqi government. Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri has been killed near Tikrit in northern Iraq. In the past, Iraqi officials had already claimed to have killed al-Duri, and DNA results are still needed to confirm the identification of the body. According to Reuters, a spokesman from Saddam's Ba'ath Party had denied the report. Al-Duri had been a top fugitive of Saddam Hussein's government for the last 10 years and an underground leader of Sunni insurgencies. Italian President Matteo Renzi met with President Obama this morning, discussing economic and security concerns. The 2 leaders agreed to work more closely on the growing instability in Libya and the rising influence of ISIS. Italy has been struggling to deal with immigrants from Libya and other parts of North Africa who cross the Mediterranean to find refuge. Cardinal Francis George, former Archbishop of Chicago, died after a long battle with cancer today. Charlotte Gibson reports.
Cardinal Francis George was Chicago's first native to serve as its archbishop. He was a vigorous defender of Roman Catholic orthodoxy who led the U.S. bishops' fight against Obamacare and played a key role in the church's response to the clergy sex abuse scandal in 2002. George said publicity of the sex abuse crisis in the church can help prevent the same thing from happening elsewhere.
The spotlighting of this behavior, which is a moment of grace. If it permits victims to come forward who otherwise would not have come forward, that's something that's very good that can come out of this scandal.
Cardinal Francis George retired as Chicago Archbishop in the fall of 2014. Charlotte Gibson, Columbia Radio News.
Robert Bates, the police volunteer deputy officer accused of killing Eric Harris in Tulsa, Oklahoma, spoke on the Today Show on NBC for the first time this morning since the shooting.
First and foremost, let me apologize to the family of Eric Harris. You know, this is the second worst thing that's ever happened to me, or first, ever happened to me in my life.
Bates is accused of second-degree manslaughter after confusing his handgun for his stun gun. Adelie Ponte, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Ariana Skybell.
And I'm Teresa Avila. In the last month, 4 candidates have announced they are running for president. That's 3 Republicans, Senators Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Rand Paul, and 1 Democrat, former Senator and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
I spoke with reporter Reed Epstein from the Wall Street Journal, who is on the ground in New Hampshire, to get a feel for what's at stake for both parties. I asked him why Clinton announced her candidacy so early. What's she going to do for the next year and a half before the primary?
She's going to be doing a lot of what we saw her do this week and what she's going to be doing next week, and that's trying to present herself as somebody who is in touch with regular people. And so in order to try to present herself as that kind of champion, she's going to be in New Hampshire on Monday and Tuesday doing a series of small bore events where she's trying to make herself look like a regular person. And that's essentially what she's going to be doing until she is formally declared the Democratic nominee.
Should she be worried about people like Martin O'Malley or Bernie Sanders?
Not as far as nomination is concerned. All of the polling indicate that Democrats think extremely highly of her. They want to win. They see her as really the only plausible vessel to do that at this point. But there was a point 8 years ago where people thought that about her as well. It didn't work for her then.
So why so early for the GOP candidates?
It's not necessarily all that early. In the 2008 cycle, then Senator Obama and Hillary Clinton were both announced January of 2007. The real difference is that some of the sort of post-Citizens United campaign fundraising laws have changed, and it actually makes more sense for somebody like Jeb Bush to not get in, because as long as he's not an official candidate, he can go to these big donors and ask them to make 6- and 7-figure contributions to the super PAC that's eventually going to propel his campaign once he is a candidate.
And you wrote today that Mr. Bush is sort of departing from his conservative base a little bit in supporting the legalization of undocumented immigrants and his stance on Common Core. I mean, how's that going to go for him if he does announce?
Well, it's really it's one of the things that we're watching today here in New Hampshire is the sort of reception that Jeb Bush is going to get, because he is asked at almost every stop in New Hampshire about immigration and Common Core, and he's stuck to his guns.
So in the Democratic Party, of course, this may change, but there's really one front runner, Hillary Clinton, and we do see for the GOP, we've got a lot of potential candidates. You know, what are the advantages or disadvantages of being in either of those positions?
Well, certainly for Hillary Clinton, having effectively an entire party apparatus behind you already means that she can be a general election candidate. But without a real credible candidate to challenge her, there's not nearly as much pressure on her to do so as there is on the Republican side, where there are, depending on who you count as a candidate, as many as 19 Republican presidential candidates just in New Hampshire this weekend. And there's a lot more pressure to stand out, and you see candidates taking positions that will get them noticed.
And do you think that's sort of the main reason why there are so many GOP candidates?
You break up the GOP field into the candidates who sort of might be president and the candidates who are perhaps in this because they have an ulterior motive, whether it's because they're trying to sell books or because they are trying to raise their profile or because they'd like to get picked for a vice presidential slot or a cabinet position.
You know, things are probably going to change a lot in the next couple of years while we see all of this unfold. What should the average American be paying attention to at this point?
How these men and women who are trying to be president or react to sort of the nature of questions that are posed to them, how they interact with voters in some of these early states.
Okay, well, Reed, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you, anytime.
Reed Epstein covers national politics for the Wall Street Journal.
"42 people were arrested in New York earlier this week in a march to end police brutality. The focus on police brutality has spurred a national debate on race.
In the past, many white people have found these conversations difficult, often avoiding them altogether. But now, from New Orleans to New York, white people are gathering in small groups to talk about racial issues. Joe Sykes reports.
Is a self-proclaimed redneck. He released a YouTube video last week, filming himself close up in his pickup truck.
Many years I was a racist, and I didn't like blacks. They used to call me N-word and whatnot.
But he says he's changed, and other white people need to too.
Stop being defensive. Don't ever ignore racism. If you hear something racist, stand up as a white American.
It's gone viral. Over 1 million people have watched Dixon's video on YouTube. Dixon seems an unlikely person to lead a new conversation about race. Robin DiAngelo is author of the book, What Does It Mean to Be White?
White fragility is the concept that when it comes to challenges to our racial worldview, white people, we don't cope well.
She coined the term white fragility to describe the way whites often react when race comes up in conversation. What that looks like is
anger, rebuttal, argument, withdrawal, demanding that we are the ones that have been victimized.
In New York, there are a couple of groups who are taking on the conversation for themselves. Dan Zanes is in his early 50s and a long-time rock and roller, but most of his gigs these days are for the under 10 set. He's no redneck, but according to him, he is still a racist.
I think it's hard to be white in America and not absorb that.
But Zanes is not going to just leave it at that. So he and a bunch of other white people meet once a month in a harshly lit conference room just off Times Square. It's a support group of sorts, and everyone being white helps.
If we gather as white people and talk about these things, we can just let it out, in multiracial settings, which are incredibly important, of course. I think sometimes if we're not up to speed as white people, we can drag the conversation down, or we can just be, generally frustrating.
Part of the goal is to create a safe space, so no recording. A chance for people to share their worst and best thoughts. Things about privilege and white guilt. Stuff they couldn't talk about with their white or black friends. It's a movement that seems to be growing. Since the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August, Zanes says the group has seen its numbers rise from about 10 people to 5 times that.
All hell's breaking loose. I think it's a time. I think there are a lot of people that are looking for something now. There's very few mechanisms for white folks to actually talk about race.
Zanes says what makes it hard is he never learnt this stuff as a kid. But at the Little Red Schoolhouse in the West Village, these conversations start early.
This is the lobby. This is where the action happens.
Sandra Chapman, or Chap, is the diversity director at Little Red. She's pointing to a series of social justice posters made by 8th graders.
Black males are 21 times more likely to be shot by a police officer than their white counterparts.
Chap then leads me to a classroom of fidgety 3rd graders.
Hi.
Hello. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Today, they're talking social justice.
So I see lots of hands. Let's go to 1, 2, 3.
I think an activist is somebody who takes a step forward when everybody else is scared to.
They stand up for other people.
What they do is they basically don't use violence, they just use their words.
Little Red is an independent school. Tuition's up to $40,000 a year and is about 70% white. Most of these kids are pretty privileged. So Chap teaches her students from a very early age that talking about race is only a first step. They break into groups by activist.
Cesar Chavez, could you please stand and go next door? Nelson Mandela, join Miles.
At Table Mandela, Crosby and Violet are sharing notes on who the South African leader was.
Nelson Mandela led black African people go to the beach. So Nelson Mandela, he led the African Americans to freedom.
They're testing things out. They might get it wrong, but this is only just the beginning. And they're doing what Dan Zanes and Dixon White never did growing up. They're talking about justice and fairness and race. Joe Sykes, Columbia Radio News.
Another very small minority is experiencing serious discrimination. In many African countries, albinos, people with a genetic disorder causing a lack of color pigment in the hair and skin, are harassed, some even killed.
To help raise awareness, the UN declared June 13th International Albinism Day. As Gregoire Moll reports, there are still lots of misconceptions to fight, and it's a worldwide struggle.
Albinism is a genetic disorder that strikes one person in 20,000. Rick Guidotti was photographing people with physical and genetic disorders when he went to Mali and took a picture of a young albino girl named Siri. In the picture, you can see her skin is damaged. That's because her father was afraid that Siri would bring a curse on the household, so he banished her to the outdoors under the African sun.
They put Siri out of the house and the mother out of the household. And the mother, not knowing what to do, didn't know anything about albinism, put Siri in direct sunlight, thinking that would make her dark like her brothers and sisters.
Life is tough for albinos, even when their relatives don't think they're a curse. Angie Kiyong has learned that, as the mother of 2 sons who are albinos. Like many people who have the disorder, her older son has poor eyesight.
So there will be a hole, or there will be a step up or a step down, and he just freezes. He's afraid because he can't tell if it's up or down or if it's a hole, and he stops and just won't move.
And when he started school, Kiyong learned children can be cruel to albinos.
One kid came to him and said that he was like a rattlesnake because rattlesnakes are white and my son is white, and rattlesnakes are evil, so my son must be evil.
Kiyong is part of a movement that tries to make life better for albinos in the US and around the world. So is Abubakar Sako, an albino from Senegal. He says albinos in Africa are constantly reminded of the prejudice against them.
You are outside, you go school, you go market, or you are working on the street. You feel that every single day people are running away. When they saw you, they're running away.
But the worst case scenario is not when people are running away from albinos, Sako says, but when they are running at them. There is a superstition in some African countries which says that parts of albinos' bodies bring good luck. And when people go to traditional healers, Sako says they can get advice like this.
If you want to succeed, you have to get that from albinos. Sometimes they can say the hair, sometimes they can say the legs, the bodies.
Other superstitions says that albinos are ghosts, or that having sex with them cures AIDS. These beliefs have led to abuses and murders. According to the UN, at least 1 albino is killed every month in Africa, on average. And many attacks may never be documented. Malawi is the latest nation in Africa whose government is trying to tackle the issue. Adam Ashford teaches Afro-American and African studies at the University of Michigan. He says that Malawi's order for police to shoot on sight probably won't prevent albinos from being assaulted.
The likelihood of police being around when anybody's attacking albinos is pretty low. I'm not even sure that Malawian police are armed, most of them.
Even when albinos don't fear for their life, they have other needs that are not being met. Ashford says that something as simple as getting access to sunscreen would make a big difference.
The rates of skin cancer are extremely high. In rural Malawi or Tanzania, you cannot get sunscreen or good sunglasses. So that is probably the number one problem.
Until something changes, some albinos in Africa will have to live like 2 boys in one of the pictures taken by photographer Rick Guidotti.
The images here is really two great, wonderful brothers. They're about 12 years old.
One of them is albino. For his own protection, he left his family and went to a highly protected school. His brother, who is not albino, wanted to be with him, so he went too.
So he and his brother are living in heavily guarded school in the Shinyanga region that had a fence all the way around it that had a great big hole on one side, so it didn't look like the safest area, but it was patrolled.
Every year that passes, activist Angie Kiyong hopes that schools like that get closer to the day when they can take down the barbed wire. Gregoire Moll, Columbia Radio News.
After-school programming has been credited with keeping kids off the streets and teaching them skills they can't just learn in the classroom.
But most of the time, the organizations that provide it are so busy working with kids, there's little time to find resources. Paula Lem reports from today's Cultivating Curiosity Resource Expo.
A thick line snakes around some tents and through the entrance to the Air and Space Museum on Pier 86. There are over 70 organizations, roughly 700 people aboard. But they're not here to tour the retired aircraft carrier. The goal is to connect the kids they serve to the resources they need. Suzanne Hurley directs programming for high school students through the City University of New York. Today, she's hoping to hook up with someone who can give her program funding. There are some unique expenses.
I'm begging now for a yoga teacher for July, and I'm getting rates of $150 an hour. The funding we get, we cannot hire someone at $150 an hour.
Hurley says yoga will help students deal with high stress levels. These kids live in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where poverty rates are nearly double the statewide average.
Access to resources is just not there for them. The students don't get a chance sometimes to leave the 1 mile radius or so where they live.
Hurley says her organization opens up kids to experiences they wouldn't otherwise have. And that's why after-school programming is a must, says Hurley. Inside the expo, 2 levels up, Candice Reyes-D'Andrea weaves between the museum's airplanes and crowds of people. She works for the New York City's Department of Youth and Community Development. Reyes-D'Andrea put together today's event. She says many organizations have yet to take advantage of resources like the exhibits at the Air and Space Museum.
The purpose of this is to tell these program directors and supervisors, hey, did you know that there is this organization, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, is in your neighborhood, and you can work with them and use their resources for the kids and youth in your program.
Phil Pham is manning a table at the expo. His organization, Building Beats, gives kids instruction to become hip-hop producers.
How do you do that? Cool.
In this Building Beats video, 2 young girls work with an instructor. Pham says kids respond well to Building Beats programming. The challenge for him is networking.
We want to reach out to more organizations that want us to bring our work to the students.
For these programs to fill the gaps where traditional schooling leaves off, organizers like Pham are grateful to connect and compare notes. Paula Lem, Columbia Radio News.
In light of the recent killings of unarmed black men by police, activists are asking, are these deaths a violation of human rights? Nardos Mesmer reports.
A group of human rights activists held a forum today at the Public Policy Institute at the Roosevelt House at Hunter College. The featured speaker at the event was Gwen Carr. The agenda of the day were broad human rights topics like reproductive rights, immigration reform, and homelessness. The featured speaker focused on the biggest topic of the day, police brutality. Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Garner, the Staten Island man who died at the hands of Staten Island police, says the video of his death still haunts her.
We all seen the video. It plays in my head over and over and over again. I guess I'll be looking at it for the rest of my life.
Carr says she was aware of police brutality, but it really hit home when her son was killed.
But with the death of my son, it has really enhanced my awareness of the cruel and the inhumane things that some police officers do towards us as, people of color and Latinos. We suffer the greatest impact of this injustice. At the hands of the police, they violate our civil rights, our human rights, and our equal rights. And there's no accountability for their misconduct.
But conference organizers say the Constitution protects all civil rights, it just isn't applied equally. Janice McDonald teaches law at Syracuse University, and she attended the conference today because she has been interested on how police brutality is a human rights issue.
This has been happening for since after the slavery was ended, where the people used law enforcement, the Ku Klux Klan and others used the law enforcement as a way to put a badge on their violence.
The conference organizer, Cynthia Suhu, says all countries that signed to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 need to apply it evenly.
Human rights standards apply to all countries, and we think about human rights in the United States often about being about other countries, but it really is a recognition that all people, no matter where they live, what country they live in, have basic fundamental rights.
Such as freedom from slavery, freedom from torture, life, liberty, and security of person.
The reason why we need human rights in the United States or in other countries is because for some reason our government or our policies aren't really enabling people to have the full enjoyment of their human rights.
Many of the organizers of today's conference are looking ahead to meet in May at the larger Human Rights Council in Geneva. Nardos Mesmer, Columbia Radio News.
New York is the only state in the country to ban professional mixed martial arts events. New York fighters have to travel out of state to compete and gain national recognition in the increasingly popular sport.
Charlotte Gibson reports that momentum is growing in Albany to legalize the violent fight clubs in New York.
Every Thursday, a dozen mixed martial arts fighters gather at the Renzo Gracie Academy, just 2 blocks from the iconic Madison Square Garden. The sport is unarmed combat, involving the technique and skills from different disciplines of the martial arts, including grappling, submission holds, kicking, and striking. Amateur fighters Brandon Van Cleve and Ezekiel Okunula warm up on the large blue mats spread across the bottom floor of the gym alongside the other fighters. Then, they step into this enormous circular platform that is caged in by a black fence and padding wrapped around the top of the fence. This fight takes place in what is called the octagon, and it literally looks like a cage for humans without a top. Van Cleve prepares to enter the cage and practice fight with Okunula.
It's a different world when the cage door locks, and it's the most peaceful place on earth and chaos at the same time, and that's what makes it beautiful.
The cage is 30 feet across and 6 feet high. Its walls and padded surfaces protect fighters from falling out or getting thrown out during the fight.
And the bell rings, it's like a snap, and you do what you know. You do what you've been training, and just what's your instinct, more or less, and nothing else matters.
Van Cleve and Okunula walk into the cage. They stand at opposite corners of the octagon. They glare at each other, oblivious to everything else outside the cage. Then, they begin to pivot their feet and move towards the middle of the mat. Okunula jabs his fist towards the center of Van Cleve's chest. Van Cleve pivots to the left. It's like a dance. After a few minutes, the 2 fighters switch positions. Okunula kicks Van Cleve in his side. Sweat drips from their foreheads, but the 2 don't even look out of breath. What Van Cleve and Okunula are doing is legal because it's a practice fight. What they can't do is fight for money. They said they have to travel out of state to places like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and California to compete in fights. Across the gym, 26-year-old Jared Gordon is grappling with another opponent on a large blue mat. He said he started competing at the age of 16 in underground fight clubs around the city and didn't like the experience.
It's like a bunch of knuckleheads, and they think they're martial artists, but meanwhile these guys are started fighting a year ago. They're 32 years old, fighting a 16-year-old. They're knocking kids out. They think they're tough guys, and it just makes a bad name for the sport.
Gordon works out at the Renzo Gracie Academy almost every day because he wants to become a professional and do it the right way this time. There's a ray of hope for MMA fighters from New York like Gordon, Van Cleve, and Okunula. Last month, the New York State Senate passed a bill that would allow for legal fights in New York. Democratic Senator Joseph Adabo of Queens co-sponsored the bill and has long supported the effort to legalize the sport in the state.
We are certainly missing out on the jobs and the revenue. That's why I support it, but I also support it knowing that the safeguards are there. This is a regulated sport, probably, in my opinion, more regulated than boxing.
Only 14 of the 47 senators voted against the bill. Democratic Senator Liz Krueger of Manhattan continues to be one of the biggest opponents of the bill.
Mixed martial arts is an incredibly dangerous activity that has displayed a pattern of unchallenged misogyny. Research shows that almost a third of MMA fights result in traumatic brain injuries, many times more than hockey, football, or even boxing and kickboxing.
MMA is a combat sport and is indeed dangerous. About 1/3 of professional mixed martial arts matches end in knockout or technical knockout, according to the American Journal of Sports Medicine. The study indicated a higher incidence of brain trauma than boxing or other martial arts. MMA fighters and advocates disagree.
It's one of the safest sports out there.
Ultimate Fighting champion, coach, and mixed martial artist Tori Chisholm says that the mixed martial arts techniques used by the fighters are what makes the sport safer than it appears.
You're using kicks, you're using submissions and takedowns, so the damage that's inflicted goes all around your body.
Chisholm argues that MMA is safer than boxing. He says that in boxing, a fighter can be knocked out for up to 10 seconds and still continue a fight. But in MMA, the rules and regulations prohibit a fighter from continuing the fight if he is knocked out.
And in MMA, if two of us are fighting and you hit me with, let's say, a head kick or a really strong punch, and I go down and I'm staggered and I'm not able to defend myself, the ref doesn't stop and say, okay, come on, get back up, defend yourself, let me count. That fight is over.
Back at the Henzo Gracie Academy in Midtown, Van Cleef finishes up his afternoon practice. Van Cleef says his main focus right now is training. He will travel to New Jersey on June 6th for his first professional fight, and what he says is the start of his career.
I accomplished everything I set my heart on, and this is just one more thing to accomplish. So I'm sure it's going to be a hard road, it's going to be tough, and it already has been.
The bill to legalize the sport he loves is currently in committee in the New York State Assembly. Backers are optimistic because the new Assembly Speaker, Carl Heastie, was once listed as a co-sponsor on the legalization bill. The New York Assembly will have until the end of June to legalize the sport. Charlotte Gibson, Columbia Radio News.
Workers have been protesting for wage increases, and states are currently reassessing the hourly wage requirement. Commentator Nardos Mesmer asks, why aren't interns included in this struggle for fair wages?
University of New York Brooklyn College, I interned in the office of Manhattan Borough President Scott Stringer. It was unpaid, but a phenomenal opportunity. The experience and references led to several others. I was offered an editorial internship at Hearst Media. I immediately fell in love with the magazine industry. What I didn't love? The internship was full-time and the only compensation was for class credit. That meant I had to pay tuition in exchange for the internship. I did it, hoping it would transition into a job. After graduating from CUNY Brooklyn, I secured a position as an editorial assistant. The catch? Byline credit only, no wages. Recognizing that the editorial industry was in poor shape and my college degree was not producing opportunities for paid work, I decided to apply to Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism to make myself more marketable. Now, in my final weeks of my master's degree, I attended the Career Expo where over 100 media companies were represented. I was invited to interview for an internship at one of the radio companies. I soon learned the 2-day-a-week position would be unpaid. Again? We are living in a time when Mayor de Blasio is rallying for a minimum wage increase to $13 an hour. So unskilled workers are guaranteed a minimum wage, but it's not illegal to ask a person with a master's degree and professional experience to work without pay? The Department of Labor holds that unpaid internships are not a violation of labor laws because it is for the benefit of the intern, not the employer. Really? In 2013, a judge found that 2 interns at Fox Searchlight qualified as employees and were entitled to minimum wage benefits. At Hearst, a former unpaid intern initiated a class action lawsuit for unpaid wages. At Condé Nast, 2 interns sued for being paid under the mandated minimum wage, and now the publisher won't hire interns at all. Recently, a judge ruled that unpaid interns were not protected under New York State and city human rights law, and therefore couldn't sue for sexual harassment. De Blasio signed a law protecting unpaid interns under a civil rights code. Now, it seems unpaid interns have the right of a paid employee without employee wages. These lawsuits are not just arguments about financial reform, but a cultural change in the way interns are compensated in a workplace. It's high time journalism interns banded together and protested for fair wages, or at least wrote about it.
Nardos Mesmer is still counting on eventually landing a paid internship.
That concludes this edition of Uptown Radio.
Dasha Lisitsina commanded the fleet as executive producer. Senior producer Tyler Daniels brought us to port.
Director Camille Von Cannell steered the studio ship with first mates Gregoire Moll and Joe Sykes.
Down in the hull, editors Hannah Kleinberg and Ariel Richen penned today's script.
And we made digital waves thanks to our webmaster, Anjali Sastry.
Thanks to our seaworthy reporters who brought us the stories you heard today.
Special thanks to our trusty admirals, Carrie Donahue, Danielle Alarcon, Rick Carr, and John Dingus. I'm Ariana Skybell.
And I'm Teresa Avila. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4 p.m. and on WBAI Mondays at 5 a.m. You can download our podcast, find us online at uptownradio.org, and follow us on Twitter at Uptown Radio. Thanks for listening.